Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. So this part I'm going to read. I just want to dedicate this talk to the late Leon Wildes of Englewood, New Jersey. He was John and Yoko's immigration attorney who fought hard and won their fight to stay in the United States. As you must know, his son Michael is your mayor. And if you haven't read Leon's book, please read it. It's called John Lennon versus the USA, the inside story of the most bitterly contested and influential deportation case in United States history. And he wins the award for a longer book title than mine. So John's unprecedented case was finally won in 1975 after a long fight. It has since become the basis of the Deferred Action for Childhood and Parental Arrivals executive orders, which President Obama issued in 2012 to protect immigrants threatened with deportation. John and Yoko were always in the public eye, and during their immigration case in April 1973, they announced the formation of a conceptual country, Newtopia. John had been denied permanent U.S. residence based on his London drug bust in 1968, and the cop who planted the drugs was later busted and convicted. John was given 60 days to leave the country. Yoko was granted permanent residence status in order to continue the search for her child Kyoko, who had been abducted by her second husband. The potential separation would have been tremendous hardship because the couple relied upon each other heavily for their well-being and were closely interdependent. Their attorney, Leon Wildes, held a press conference on April 2nd, 1973 at the Association of the Bar in Midtown Manhattan. As a surprise to everyone, including their attorney, John and Yoko waved white handkerchiefs to announce the birth of Newtopia, a conceptual country. The name Newtopia was inspired by Thomas More's book, Utopia, the title of which translates from modern Latin as no place. The Lennons declared themselves Newtopian ambassadors, which would in essence give them complete immunity from deportation. The white handkerchiefs were the flag of Newtopia. John said, "It's a sign of submission and you can blow your nose in it." And this is the declaration. We announce the birth of a conceptual country. Citizenship of the country can be obtained by declaration of your awareness of Newtopia. It has no land, no boundaries, no passports, only people. No laws other than cosmic. All people of Newtopia are ambassadors of the country. As two ambassadors of Newtopia, we ask for diplomatic immunity and recognition in the United States of our country and its people. And you would also recognize the correlation between this and the lyrics to the song Imagine, which imagine there's no countries. So that's thanks to this guy, and there's his son, who's also very close to Yoko now and still. So that's the Newtopia story, and I'll sit for the rest. Get the code. Okay, so I'll tell you about the book, and then I'll answer questions, and I can sign some books. So Yoko's life with and without John was extraordinary. There are 2 documentaries coming out this month about 2 episodes in 1972 only. One is their co-hosting of the Mike Douglas show. It's called Daytime Revolution. Fantastic documentary by Eric Nelson, who directed John Lennon versus the USA. And another one about the one-to-one concert from 1972 when I attended at age 14. So this is like 4 hours worth of film, just about 2 things they did in 1972. So this is why my book is 560 pages. This thing keeps going off. Hold on. Why is it? All right. So anyway, Yoko's one of the most famous women in the world, yet there's so little really known about her. Her story goes way beyond what you all know, and no other book to date encompasses her whole life. There's only books about her art, and they don't even touch on her biography. So just a little bit about me is I'm just a music fan ever since seeing Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show when I was 6 years old. And I saw a lot of concerts throughout the 70s, met a lot of my idols, and I was writing for my college newspaper in the 70s, New York Tech. And then I was working for College Media Journal, CMJ, and my great Jeff Tamarkin, my editor, is sitting right here. And writing in the 70s didn't pay enough. So I had to do normal office jobs until I could retire and really start writing. So in 2002, I started my blog, MadelineX.com. And I only write about the artists I love. There's no criticism on here. If you don't like something, don't write about it. Let the people who love it write about it. That's what I think. And I just try to keep the memories of these artists alive and tell all my funny stories about getting backstage and meeting them and all that. So I write album retrospectives on their 40th, 50th, and now 60th anniversaries. I don't know if I'll be around to write about the 70th anniversaries, but it's amazing to look at them all in retrospect. And I discovered Yoko when I was 9 years old. In 1967, I saw an article in my aunt's Time magazine, and she's standing in front of a frame of her film Bottoms. And this was naked bottoms walking on a treadmill in close-up. So you couldn't really even tell it was a bottom. It's just like moving parts. And I just completely identified with this. I'm like, wow, here's an adult that's doing something really kooky. And, my parents were really serious and older. So I just thought, wow, this person could be my friend, my little imaginary friend. So I saved the article. And then a few months later, the Beatles' White Album came out in 1968. And I realized she's with John Lennon. And I'm like, wow, now I can find out everything she's doing. So I saved everything I could find about her, every article. And luckily I saved it in chronological order because it was the wealth of information I used for my book that I didn't even know I was writing. So John and Yoko were in my childhood every day in the 60s and 70s. And they understood the power of celebrity and the responsibility. And they always radiated positivity and humor. And I just felt like it was a part of history, like witnessing the bed-ins and all the things they were doing. And Yoko told Playboy in 1980, in India, you have to be a guru instead of a pop star. Guru is the pop star of India, and pop star is the guru here. And that's how it is, They look to these rock stars for the answer. And they figured, well, we're portraying, we have all this intention on us, we better give some people truth and tell them to look for the truth. And ultimately, even though they always were so truthful, they were greatly misunderstood and misinterpreted. But they were sincere and totally honest, and I just felt like they were my family. So the book is a collection of short stories I'd written over many, many years. Even notes, I would see her on television and write down everything she said and did, or go to concerts and write down everything and read every article. And during COVID, my boyfriend Frank gave me this software and he said, dump all your Word documents in here and you can arrange them and see what you have. And I started organizing this and I realized I had a 500-page book. And it took me another 2 years to flesh it out and write forward and afterward and make it, sequential and debunk all the lies and rumors that have been written about her. So my style is very straightforward, simple, just like Yoko's messages. You can read each short chapter alone or skip around, all the characters, and everybody's finding it really uplifting because she's so enlightening. And, I can recall when we spoke about certain things or when she spoke about them in interviews, in magazines. So if I was working on a particular story about an album, I'd go back to whatever month and year she spoke about that in NME or Melody Maker or whatever in England, where they listen to her a lot more, actually. And I could pull the quotes and really write about the album. So I featured her voice a lot in the book because she's so eloquent and she has an amazing sense of humor. And most journalists didn't let her talk for so long about herself. It was always about John or the Beatles. And the vicious lies needed to be debunked, and I felt it was my responsibility to tell her true story and just convey her spirit. So basically, she's masterful and thoughtful. She kind of speaks in parables like a little guru, and she's focused and highly original, way ahead of her time. She considered everyone her equal, and she was never in awe of anybody, and she doesn't care about materialism, although people think, oh, she's so wealthy. Yeah, she came from a banking billionaire family, but she chose to live frugally just to pursue her art. And she's benevolent and she's really wise, sly sense of humor. And her main objective is to get us to slow down and let ideas into our heads and to better the world. And, it's a big task. John and Yoko both took this on, but even they, I guess, couldn't do it, but they at least planted seeds in our heads about how we could. And she mostly anonymously donated to charities worldwide, so you don't hear about that, but she's helped so many individuals, so many groups, so many people, monetarily and also in many, many ways. And I spent a lot of time with her and got a lot of insight. And I wrote to her by mail when I was a kid, when they first moved into Dakota, and I had an address. I'm like, well, I just tell her how much I love her. And she would write back, and we began this correspondence. And eventually she began inviting me after John was killed. This was in the 70s when I was writing to her, but then she got back together with John, and I thought, they're together. And I was busy at CBGB's with the punk rock, and I was like, oh, good, they're fine, And then after John was killed, that was 2 years of my life. I was a zombie. But then after that, I started writing again, and she started showing John's artwork in galleries at the time, and she invited me to some of those exhibitions and then some of her own work. And then she started doing more concerts, and I'd go backstage and talk to her there. And she just was so happy that I knew her work so well and would speak about it. And she once wrote back to me, "Your intelligent observations always touch me." So she knew I got her. So that's why she was so warm. And when you meet her, you can understand immediately why John loved her. And she comes from a metaphysical place with these abstract ideas. She's, despite the hardships and the backlash and everything she got, she's always been positive, and she never gave up hope. So people ask about my research, but this book came together organically. I didn't have to go search for anything. I just knew what was important. I wanted to paint a picture of her that was really accurate and showed her spirit. And I think it's been done because people are loving it. So I used interviews of the time because I didn't want to use people's faded memories or speculations or, things that may not have happened actually. So it's mostly told by Yoko in her voice. I use a lot of quotes from John, their son Sean, and all of it is backed up by facts. And I include even Pete Townsend and Phil Spector and Paul McCartney's published recollections of his role as the first Beatle that met Yoko, and his little known part in reuniting John and Yoko after they were separated. And that's an interesting story. And I assembled all these perfectly fitting puzzle pieces to an undeniably true story. So it's entirely different than any other biography. Most books are just about her art, as I said, and this is the first with lots of compelling detail, not for the sake of detail, but the details are so important and so stunning and fit into the story so perfectly. And I like biographies by authors who are not trying to vilify someone, who generally cares about their subject and has firsthand knowledge. So that's why I thought I better do this, because she's not writing her own autobiography at this point. So I'm glad I did. And people ask me what my challenges were, but all I can say is the challenges disappeared after I talked to a few publishers and hung up the phone and said, I'm doing this myself. Because they said, you have to cut this in half, 250, it's an esoteric subject, she's not well liked. I'm like, well, she's not well liked because nobody wrote the actual book about her. So I'm also self-promoting. I'm getting amazing reviews. It's now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame library. It's acclaimed in Mojo and Goldmine, recommended by George Harrison's wife, Olivia. It's got honorable mention in the Beatles gift guide. David Frick of Rolling Stone loved it. Yoko's colleagues, her family, Kyoko, Sean, her grandson, I can't be more happy that, they're really loving it. And her closest friends, Dan Richter, who was their assistant in the 70s, and Elliot Mintz, who has a book coming out himself. He called it a masterpiece. And Indica Gallery owner, John Dunbar, who introduced John to Yoko, loves it. I spent time with him last summer, and he was married to Marianne Faithfull. He gave her a copy. So this is all great. One interviewer called it, it's page after page of wonder. And I broke all the rules. I kept it simple, which people find refreshing, and they say they reread their favorite chapters and enjoy her cosmic consciousness. And the people who should read it are the misinformed. I doubt they will. One person messaged me and said, I bought your book. I despise Yoko, but I like reading stories about Hitler and Rasputin. I said, well, thank you for being open-minded enough to buy this, and never heard from her again. So I guess she liked it. I don't know. I mean, if she didn't like it, I guess she would have written something else. So if you like Yoko, you're going to like her even more. And if you don't know and you're spreading lies, you're going to stop. So it's not just about Yoko. I illuminate the shimmering 60s and the turbulent 70s. And you all know the characters who are quoted. It was an important time with so much history and so much positivity until the Manson murders in Altamont when everything changed. But the deep love story of John and Yoko is woven throughout. And although it seems like an eternity, John and Yoko are only together for 12 years. And when they met, they were extremely lonely, they were suffering, they were misunderstood, and then they nourished and saved each other. And the 12 years they were together includes this 18-month separation. So it really wasn't that much time. And each of them were fragile and alone, but together they were strong and grounded and became soulmates. And they tried to include us in their love story, trying to reassure us that everything was going to be all right. But their relationship became a dramatic comedy and a tragedy, thanks to the public. And Yoko's now 91 years old. Her life is 33 years before meeting John. She was 33 when she met him. He was 26. There's 12 years with him and over 40 years of work since his death. And the Beatles were a blip in her life, but this is all she's ever associated with. And I include fascinating historical facts and about her life as a war child in Tokyo during the bombings of World War II and her privileged and lonely childhood. And if you've seen her Twitter account, you'll know the tweets are like the best messages you could get in a fortune cookie. And you just like stop and think, and oh my God, I didn't think about this. And you have to reread it to like absorb all the wisdom. And she says things like, your fear is protecting you, or water is more valuable than gold. Simple things that we don't, it's so true, we know it's true, but we don't realize it. So, no cloud can cloud us forever. The child in you will save you. There's hundreds of these. So, we think in terms of neighborhood and community and a trip to Europe maybe, but Yoko thinks about infinite universes. She's way beyond. And she's a humanitarian. She's showing us our inner power. She's extremely generous and all about giving. And one example of her kindness is that, she felt an affinity with John's fans because she was a fan too. She loved John, and she realized that we all had the same loss when he was killed. So this girl wrote her a letter and said that John died on her birthday. And Yoko was devastated. And she wrote back to the girl and she said, don't think of this as the day John died. Think of it as the day his soul went to travel the universe. And she continued sending this girl a birthday card every year for decades. So that's just Yoko in a nutshell. I mean, how can you write anything bad about this woman? So all of her art is unfinished. And that means she presents a germ of an idea for us to interpret and expand upon. And she encourages participation, she makes us think, and shows you that it doesn't have to be tangible or permanent. Art should be transitory and enlightening, and it shouldn't have monetary value. And she says, I believe that everybody has superpower in their subconscious. I try to bring it out from them. So in a chapter titled Loneliness, I talk about her childhood and her incredible ancestry. And this is not the boring thing where great-grandmother sewed socks and grandfather imported cheese. This is amazing people. They were wealthy billionaires. Her great-grandfather started the banking billionaire empire of the Yasuda Bank. And she descended from nobility and other notable people. They were wealthy aristocrats, artists, musicians, and history makers. Zenjiro, on her mother's side, she had a picture of him, and John looked at it and he said, "This guy is me in a past life," because he had almond-shaped eyes and he felt like he resembled him. And Yoko said, "Don't say that, he was assassinated." And there's all kinds of weird stuff like that throughout the book, because he was assassinated by a socialist rebel who was against his banking system. And her uncle, through marriage, was Japan's first ambassador to the UN. And he was at the Emperor's surrender in 1945 aboard the USS Missouri. And her paternal grandfather was from a samurai clan. He was the first Japanese person in the world to earn a PhD. Her paternal grandmother was a pioneering feminist, and her father descended from a 9th century emperor. Her Russian aunts, through marriage, the Bubnova sisters, was a renowned painter and violinist who taught in Japan and were very renowned for emerging Russian and Japanese culture. And in 1977, John organized a family reunion in Japan to show their son Sean to the family. And Yoko said, "Why would I want to go back and see all those boring people? They're the ones I left to make my own life." So these people were boring to her. And despite John's fame, her parents never heard of him, and they disapproved of him. He was wearing overalls and a beard when he went to meet them in 1971. And they also didn't like her previous 2 husbands. And they said, but compared to John, they said, hey, the other 2 were more handsome. And if anybody came home and said, hey, I'm dating a Beatle, their family was like, well, get me tickets to the concert, right? But there was none of that in her family. They were just mortified. Yeah. So John was anonymously happy in Japan because they called him Mr. Ono. She was the famous one over there. And he learned the Japanese traditions and crafts, and he spent the last few happy summers of his life there with Yoko and Sean. And Yoko's parents in her childhood were very distant. Her mother was a socialite. Her father was away on business. He was in America working in banking. He wanted to be a concert pianist. He started off doing that, but he had to get into banking to marry into the prestigious Yasuda family. And she had a super lonely childhood. She had to say goodnight to a picture of her father at night before going to bed. She didn't meet him until she was 3 years old, when they took her to America to meet him. So the family had about 30 servants. And at lunchtime, she was served at a large table all by herself and by these women standing around her wearing kimono. And they weren't allowed to speak to her because she was their superior. And they're told to call her Miss, and they're told not to touch her. And she remembers being alone in a huge garden and falling down, and these servants came and surrounded her, but they weren't allowed to touch her or pick her up. She had to just fend for herself because that would build morale. You know, you can't pick up the kid. It's so weird. So when the bombings of Tokyo occurred, first they were in air raid shelters, but then it became so bad that the parents sent Yoko and her 2 siblings to the countryside to be safer. And her mother had purchased a farmhouse there, and she didn't realize it was in such bad shape. And it had holes in the roof, and it was just a really bad situation. And they were sent there with a servant, but the servant abandoned them. But they were left with silk kimonos and rice, silk kimonos to trade for food. Rice, really. And then the people there resented them because they could tell they were from the wealthy area and they didn't want to give them food. And the children would throw stones at them. And they were actually starving and eating mulberries off the bushes. And they saw a family go in the woods to eat mushrooms. And they thought, oh, we'll go eat that. And then they found the family dead from eating poison mushrooms. So, you know, she didn't have it great. And one day in the farmhouse, her little brother was depressed and crying and hungry. So Yoko said, well, what's the matter? And he said, I'm just hungry. And she said, well, what do you want? And he said, ice cream. So she said, well, what kind? And he said, oh, chocolate. And she said, what else? Do you want a cherry on top? And he started smiling, and he was getting, more animated. And she said, well, let's make a menu. Imagine ice cream. And she realized that through imagining, we could be happy and make others happy. So that was the basis of all of her work. And then they were sent home when the bombing stopped. Luckily, their house was spared, but they're on a rickety truck through smoldering Tokyo, and she's seeing the ruins and people dead in the street. And she realizes that everything in life is transient and you can't hold on to anything. So in the book, you just read about how this all affected her mentally and artistically. And after the war, she's back at school, the prestigious school with the emperor's sons as her classmates. And one of the princes had a crush on her. She could have been a first empress, but instead she became the first female philosophy student in Japan. And then at age 19, her parents took her to move to New York State, and she attended Sarah Lawrence College. But her professor said, your stuff is really far out. You have kind of crazy ideas, but there are these people in Manhattan that are doing stuff that's more akin to what you're thinking. So she went to New York, where she'd also meet the first of her 3 husbands, and this was Toshi Ichiyanagi. He went on to become a famous composer, avant-garde composer in Japan. Her parents disapproved of him because he was a commoner. They didn't come to their wedding. They didn't give them money for the wedding. They just lived in a cold water flat. They were just doing their music and art. So he was still working until he died in 2022. And he worked with John Cage. And that was when Yoko went on tour with them in Japan. But it was a man's world, the whole art scene, music scene, everything. It was all men. There were no women composers, nothing. So she became really depressed. And she went back to Japan and was committed to a hospital because she had attempted suicide. So this is when her second husband, Tony Cox, sought her out. He was talking to some composers in New York and found out about her. And he went to Japan to find her, and he finds her in the hospital. So he gets her released, and he became her promoter, and they worked in Japan and New York. And they had a daughter, Kyoko, whom Tony basically raised, because that was the deal. Yoko said, I'll have the child, but I'm doing my work. You have to raise her, which is the same situation with John later on. But later, Tony disappeared with the child and entered a religious cult. And it was a huge source of pain for Yoko for so many years. And she had lawyers working on trying to find them. And she did win custody, but that was no good because she couldn't find the child. And they flew to Texas, and they flew everywhere and just kept missing them wherever they went. And one of the journalists who let me use a quote in the book, she did an interview with Yoko in like 1973. It's a beautiful interview. And I said, Caroline, why wasn't this ever published? And she said, well, it was for Cosmopolitan. And they said, oh no, you have to dirty this up. This isn't gonna sell papers. You have to say how she abandoned her daughter and how she turned John onto drugs. And this is what was going on. People were writing this crazy stuff about her just to sell papers. So far from abandoning her daughter, she spent many years trying to find her. And then when John was killed, the girl actually did call or send a telegram and say she was sorry. And then they reconnected in the 90s when Kyoko was pregnant with her first child. So now they're really close, and she has 2 grandchildren. So John was also born during wartime in Liverpool during the Blitz bombings of World War II. They had the same parental abandonment issues. His father went off to sea. His mother gave him to his sister to raise. And he soon learned that his mother only lived a mile away from where he was growing up. And he felt like so dejected. He's like, my God, I thought she was dead. Like, I didn't know she was there. And then he started visiting her, and they were becoming very close. But when he was 17, his mother was hit by a car and killed. So that wasn't the first person who was killed. His best friend, Stu Sutcliffe, the list isn't. His uncle George he was living with. So he had a lot of loss in his life too. He married his art college sweetheart, Cynthia, when she became pregnant, and had their son, Julian. But John was bored with the married life and the insane popularity of the Beatles in the whole whirlwind that was required from that. That's all discussed in detail in the book. And Yoko was only peripherally familiar with the Beatles when she met John in 1966. So she was 8 years older. She's born in 1933. She's a teenager in the late 1940s, and there's no such thing as rock and roll. She doesn't have posters on her walls, a turntable. She's listening to 12-tone composers and avant-garde stuff, and she's doing her own thing. So she hosted performances by cutting-edge artists at her Chamber Street loft. And this was kind of like a meltdown before meltdown existed. She gave them a place to play because there was really nowhere for them at the time. And she had artists and Peggy Guggenheim coming, Marcel Duchamp, Isamu Noguchi, John Cage, Merce Cunningham. They all came and played. And this is while John was still in the Beatles with Pete Best on drums. So John was 26 when he met Yoko. She had just published her instructional book, Grapefruit, in 1964, which became really popular. And people say, oh, she heard of the Beatles. Nobody believes that nonsense. But there was a time where the band were reminiscing about their concerts at Shea Stadium. And she said, what were you doing in a baseball stadium? So she had no idea that they had done sold-out concerts there and that they were the biggest band in the world. It's crazy. And John appreciated that her love for him wasn't based on the Beatles' worship. So Paul McCartney met Yoko first. She was told to approach him by these artists who were doing a book project for John Cage, and they wanted manuscripts. But Paul didn't want to give any away, so he said, well, why don't you, check with John Lennon? But before she could go and seek out John herself, he appears at her London art exhibition, her first one ever, and that's how they met. But I have a quote from Plastic Ono band member Klaus Vormann, the bass player, about what John was like prior to meeting Yoko. He said, even with all his success and money, John was a frustrated, helpless creature. When Yoko appeared, he bloomed. It was an amazing thing to see. Yoko was not only his lover, she was like a mother to him. They did everything together. He was so close to this woman, it's impossible to imagine. And then they underwent the primal scream therapy with Arthur Yanov. And he spoke about how broken John was. The level of his pain was enormous. He was almost non-functional. He couldn't leave his room. He had no defenses. He was falling apart. He was one big ball of pain. This is someone the whole world adored, and it didn't mean a thing. At the center of all that fame, wealth, and adulation was just a lonely little kid. And he also said that because they never completed the treatment, John remained in a wounded state all his life. He was just never completely healed. So Yoko kind of set John free from the constraints of the music he was doing. She said, when you sing I Want to Hold Your Hand, 100 million people hear that. So you can say something more important. And he realized he could be more than just a big rock star. And his first solo album was The Bearing of His Soul. And Yoko was actually nervous when John decided to leave the Beatles. She was concerned that her artistic freedom would be compromised. She was an independent artist. And you can see at those Let It Be sessions that came out in the Get Back documentary, she's knitting during the session. She's reading. Would you be knitting or reading if you're in a Beatles session, right? She's just thinking of her next artwork, her next move. And he comes along and says, okay, so I left the band. Now it's just you and me. And she literally said, I shuddered when he said this because I'm thinking, what's he going to do now? He's not preoccupied with the band. How am I going to do my work? But she didn't realize they were going to hit the ground running and jump right in. First, they got married. They did the Bed-Ins for Peace. They did the War is Over posters. They did concerts, films. It just merged naturally. They didn't have to think about it. And when she met John, fame became a burden to her. She'd rather be understood than famous, really. I mean, look where it got her. And they came from very different places. And Yoko says, John and I came from the West and the East. We represented totally different social strata, extreme opposites. In some ways, we were very different, but in others, we were totally together. We were very aware of that symbolism and how people hated us for it. We transcended the positions we were supposed to adhere to. We felt it was very magical that we fell in love and understood each other totally in spite of all the differences. And she would describe the fun they had together, saying that John had an incredible sense of humor and they always made each other laugh, and that's what she misses most. So John was murdered in front of his home on December 8, 1980, at the age of 40. Their son, Sean, was 5 years old, and Yoko saw it happen right in front of her. And I get into her devastation and her eventual resilience and the positivity that she maintained, and the responsibility of raising Sean is what kept her going. And sharing John's music with the world, protecting his legacy, helped her to heal just enough to return to her own work in time. So going back in time, John Cage had given her confidence that what she was doing wasn't crazy. And he was a respected pioneer of the non-conventional use of music and sound. And they both transcribed sounds with handwritten notations, even though they both were classically trained and could write notation. I have a whole chapter about her association with John Cage, the chapter about her with Charlotte Moorman, who was very close with Yoko, and she had organized all the avant-garde music festivals where all the artists could perform, and her association with George McTunis, who was the Fluxus founder. A really beautiful story of them and their friendship. And although she came from a billionaire banking family, she lived with no heat or furniture. She only cared about making art. And one of her boyfriends at the time said that she ate like she was famished when he took her out to dinner. And he took her home to his apartment and she took 3 baths because she didn't have a bath in her. And she did side jobs to support her art, just teaching Japanese crafts and trying to work in a macrobiotic restaurant. And her art was so ephemeral, it couldn't be bought or sold. It was just imaginary, and she didn't think about making money from art. And I have a chapter called Always Awake and Always Dreaming. She once said that, and it's just so descriptive of her. And it's just about her reverse psychology and survival mechanisms, and it's all influenced by yin and yang and Zen riddles. And she just lives in a 6-dimensional world, like the mind world. And she notices that if you burn a chair, the chair in your mind doesn't disappear. And that's the power of our minds. And to her, invisible things are important. Like air, especially air. If it's not invisible, we're in big trouble, right? It's polluted. And that history is not what happened, it's what didn't happen. And she'll hear the ticking of a clock, but she hears the sounds in between the ticking while we're hearing them. So that's what fascinated me about her. And she always says the spiritual world is where we really live. And we even all go through time differently. Some people are old at 18 and some people are young at 90. And even the most important thing, which is breathing, is unconscious. So it leaves the least effort to do the most important thing we need to do. And she's always seeing like less is more. And her Half a Wind exhibition was a white room with everything cut in half, the furniture, everything. And we're seeing the half that's there, but she's showing us the half that's missing. So that's another fascinating thing. And she says entertainment was never her goal. If an audience walked out, you did something meaningful to stir them up and to think. She says, we're all kings and queens now, asking others to entertain us. It's a sad situation because there's so much more that we must do to survive. To entertain, you must do things in a way that people understand. So you have to go to a certain place, and I wasn't doing that. Any great invention or discovery can't be done unless you're totally free of those people. So she's like, I want to deal with the world that's in subconscious, underneath the consciousness. That's where I am. So that's her. And I also, of course, she's done a lot of music, and most people just know the louder stuff. And I include chapters about every song and every album in the context of the book, not in the back like a discography, because each album had something to do with her life at the time. And she's classically trained. One of her first homework assignments was to transcribe the sounds of the birds singing at dawn. And she realized there's something wrong with the way we make notation, because it's impossible. So on the musical staff, she wrote, play this with the accompaniment of the birds at dawn. And you know what that sounds like. So she wanted to be a composer, and her father told her there are no women composers, forget that. So her music involves a lot of it, but not all, shrill, emotional vocals. But most people don't know, many of her songs are beautiful ballads and other various styles. But Japanese music, like kabuki or no theater, that's all sung in a shrill, emotional way. And her style belongs on a Japanese stage, but in America, it seems strange. And she explains this by saying, in my singing, I'm expressing something you can't express in words because it's too desperate. Like when you scream when you are drowning. If you were drowning, you wouldn't say, I'd like to be helped because I have just a moment to live. You would just scream. So she really, from her childhood and all she went through, she's emoting this stuff, and either you understand it or you don't. And Sean, her son, is her biggest fan. He was in her band, right? He organized her tours, and he loves and supports my book. And there are many quotes from him in there, and he describes what she was up against. She was struggling against so many layers, East and West, avant-garde and pop, man and woman. She was fighting racism against Japanese women and Asians, overcoming sexism because in the 60s was a boys' club, especially in rock, overcoming and breaking many barriers, opening so many doors. It was overwhelming for people because she was so ahead of her time. And when Yoko met John, he gave her a rock beat. And she said, he woke me up from my mind game. And then she gave him a sense of freedom and took him away from that beat and into avant-garde excursions. And there's a whole chapter about Japanese influence in her work. And the name Yoko means ocean child, and she uses water a lot in her work. Her writings are inspired by nature and Buddhism and haiku poetry, and they're very Zen. And the elements of nature are very prominent in her work. There are chapters about water, air, sky, trees, wind, how it's all in her work. And she always says, we've strayed far from nature. We have unhealthy societal rituals which distract us from natural things that are needed in our lives. Our unnatural cravings create a disparity between what our bodies want and what our minds need. And one of her art pieces is called A Painting to be Stepped On. And people think, oh, that's just disregard for art, or it's destructive or whatever. But nobody listens to her when she explains what it means. And in 15th century Japan, Christians were identified by being asked to step on a picture of Jesus Christ, and many of them would not even step on it, although they knew they would be killed. And she just admired that courage and conviction. So she said, as a young child, I was terrified by the story, but I also promised myself that I'd be a person to adhere to her principles, just as the Japanese Christians did. And later I wanted to release myself from that little girl in me and step on the painting. So that's, there's all meaning behind everything she does. She has cut piece where people cut away pieces of her clothing, and that's all about, other artists just show you what they want you to see. This is it. But she thought, well, the audience should be able to take what they want. And it was all about the giving nature of a Buddha. And people thought it was about feminism, really. But she said she wasn't really thinking of that at the time. And these people would come at her with a scissor, and especially men. One of them pretended he was going to stab her. And it was a very dangerous situation. But she said she would go into a trance while it was happening so that she could kind of maintain her composure. And she just says it's our biggest responsibility to give. We're responsible to give whatever we have or whatever we know. Also think of the laws of nature. High water falls low. If our cup is full, it's going to flow. It's natural for us to give because we have a lot. If we don't give, that goes against the laws of nature. And to do that, you must use tremendous unnecessary energy to keep that money. It would be very bad for us, and we're not going to do that. If we had more than we need, we'd rather let the money flow out naturally. It's just wisdom. If you're using all that unnecessary energy, it's going to get back at you one way or another. You'll get cancer or something, and it just isn't worth it. So this is her and John always giving. Yeah, they would say, oh, John is singing, Imagine No Possessions, and he has this big white mansion in England. He doesn't care. He gave all that up. He gave everything away. He gave money to everyone. It wasn't about that at all. And Pete Townsend was into all that avant-garde art in the 60s, and he'd go to those symposiums, and he remembers seeing Yoko all the time. And he said, in the mid-60s, Yoko was an agitator, a revolutionary who used peaceful techniques to shock us into a reaction. Her message has always been about saving the world. Art must find new ways of shaking people out of their stupor. Art must shock, agitate, and even irritate. It isn't for putting on the wall. That's just decoration. So I think all of you might know how she met John, but I'll kind of summarize it. So she was setting up her first exhibition in London when the gallery owner, John Dunbar, brought John in the night before the opening. And she didn't know who John was, but she thought he was kind of handsome. And John was pessimistic about modern art at the time. He thought it was pretentious and negative. And here he found something different. He sees a ladder going up to the ceiling, a painting on the ceiling with tiny letters on it, and it said yes. So he was just thrilled with that. And the second thing he saw was a blank canvas with nails around it, and it said hammer and nail. So he picked it up, he was going to do it, and she wanted to keep it clean for the opening. And she said, no. And he said, well, can I hammer an imaginary nail? And she said, oh my God, this guy gets me. So one of my favorite reviews of my book is you hit the imaginary nail on the imaginary head. So that was funny. So, Yoko thought, well, I'm starting to think maybe I can live. Before it seemed impossible. I was at the vanishing point and my things were too conceptual. But John understood me, and all those things that were supposed to vanish stayed. And she thought if she wasn't so preoccupied with the exhibition, she would have had a relationship with John. But she put the idea out of her mind because they each had a small child, they were each married, and she went away to Paris and didn't really think about it. But she went back to London to do something with Ornette Coleman and ends up seeing a whole pile of letters from John, and she says, I can't fight this. So that's it. And then they got married, and she wakes up the next day and realizes the whole world is my mother-in-law. Then the cruelty started, right? The press was really cruel. They sent her voodoo dolls in the mail. They sent letters to John saying, beware, she'll cut your throat in the night. His bandmates were also not nice to her. They didn't want her in the studio, but it was John that was bringing her there. They were driven to drugs because of that. And John placed Yoko as a buffer between himself and the world. And Dan Richter, who was their assistant at the time, he said they had an invisible radar between them so that they moved and spoke. As they moved and spoke, there was an illusion that they were almost one person. Everybody says that knew them. They were just like astral twins or something. And people were antagonistic towards them, partly because they saw this deep love or fearful they were never going to have it themselves. And Yoko says, if they only knew that we were just part of them, what we did for each other made it possible for us to do something for other people. If the world just let us be, we'd have been great. But mainly our energies were used in fighting the world from splitting us. And finally they succeeded. They split us in this big way. They really did. And I talk about the song Hey Jude, because in the summer of '68, Paul wrote this song supposedly for John's son Julian, who he had left behind. But in the lyrics, you can tell the song is actually Paul telling John, go ahead and be with Yoko. Like, you have found her, now go and get her. waiting for someone to perform with. And then the line, let it out and let it in, probably refers to the first thing that Yoko did was to hand John a card that said the word breathe. So I think that's what it's about. And, you know, they made all the films together, and she speaks about the medium of film. You can attempt to film reality, but once you turn on the lights, people become self-conscious and their thought processes change. You can never really tell what the person is like. Therefore, there's a part of life that can never be recorded or articulated. Language fails you because it simplifies reality. Logical processes can destroy the intangible aspect of life. So she's all into this intangible stuff that we're completely ignoring. So 1969 was like a crazy busy year. They say there was a shimmer in the air, and it was like everything was happening in double time. And Andy Warhol said that everyone was taking amphetamines because if you fell asleep, you would miss something. You just had to be awake all the time. The Beatles recorded Abbey Road. They were working on Let It Be, Vietnam protests, Flower Power, then the Manson murders. And, you know, John and Yoko are in the middle of all this, all wearing white, and they're dancing through the airport, and they're in bed, you know, selling peace. And John was becoming an artist, and Yoko's becoming a rock star. And they just all wanted us to share in their happiness. You know, the bed-ins were based on the 1967 Human Being, with thousands of hippies in San Francisco, with Timothy Leary delivering his line, tune in, turn on, tune in, drop out. And they recorded Give Peace a Chance during the bed-ins. And the peace events were Yoko's idea. And John said, you know, I participated like a spectator because it was Yoko's way of demonstrating. Then they did The War Is Over billboards. There's a whole chapter. And it's one of my favorite chapters about these billboards. It's just so fascinating, the way they were conceived and how they were done. And John was asked how much the billboards cost, and he said, I don't know, but it's cheaper than someone's life. And they self-funded those in 12 cities in the world. They formed Plastic Ono Band. They played in Toronto and London, and John realized now he has a musical life without the Beatles. Then they did Imagine in 1971, and in 2017, Yoko was finally given co-writer's credit on the song. And there's an audio clip of John saying, if it had been anyone other than my wife, I would have given them credit. Of course, the lyrics and concept of Imagine were inspired by a piece in Yoko's Grapefruit. There's a whole chapter about the gorgeous mansion they lived in, Tittenhurst Park. That was their Camelot. Very fascinating. It was a tree museum at one time, so it's an amazing house. Right after Imagine, they moved to New York City permanently. London was too harsh toward Yoko. They couldn't walk down the street. In New York, they were free. And little did they know that John would never return to England again. They released the Happy Christmas single in 1971. It was not a hit at the time, but I tell the whole story behind that. There's a chapter called Woman Power, just about her pioneering feminist activities. Very important chapter. Sometime in New York City album, 1972. Their immigration problems being followed by the FBI, still trying to find Yoko's daughter, associating with the radicals Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. Didn't help their case. They called off a planned U.S. tour. John had a mental breakdown, which led to their 18-month separation. And the time they were separated, John goes to LA with May Pang, okay, the 22-year-old assistant, who has a documentary out, and she's painting Yoko in a very bad light, in fact, as the devil, when all it was is Yoko saying, look, John and I are splitting up. She wanted someone trustworthy to go with John wherever he was going to go, instead of 5 other women who would take advantage of John and write books about it. So she asked me, you know, go with John, you know, and I know you'll probably fall in love, but that's inevitable. Fine. Just go and take care. But, you know, and everybody's like, how could she do this? How can she send her husband with someone else? But look at all the marital situations now that are acceptable. Multiple wives, whatever. There's so many acceptable situations with her. This seems harmless in comparison. And guess what? John came back alive. right? And he inevitably went back to Yoko. So thanks to Mei Pang for taking care of him, but no thanks for portraying her as the devil. Um, and, you know, the deportation case really ruined their lives. But finally, they won the right to stay, and they lived in the Dakota peacefully for a little while, had their son. John's violent death and the difficult aftermath are explored, and that only takes us to 1980. I mean, there's 40 more years to her life, and they said that Yoko kept John a prisoner and isolated him and starved him, but they were just, you know, macrobiotic and getting healthy and having their child, and role reversal of he was the house husband and she was still she was building his fortune. She took what he had and built it up. And I guess from her background in a banking family, she knew how to do that. So, and then Paul was instrumental in reuniting John and Yoko. I tell that whole story with quotes from Paul and Yoko. They did Double Fantasy in 1980 after 5 years of seclusion. It was an album for their peers. They were saying, you know, we made it this far. How are you doing? They were excited but nervous about its acceptance. John started hearing songs in new wave clubs on the radio that resembled Yoko's older work. So he's like, this is your time. Let's get you on record now. And her song Walking on Thin Ice was the last thing they worked on together, and she finished it off after he was killed. And during the final interview, on the day he was murdered, my friend Lori Kay and her RKO team conducted that interview. And it's amazing how filled with joy they were on the day he was killed, how optimistic he was, how happy they were going to go on tour. And that's it. Yet there were horrible things written in books after his death about this time in their life when, sure, they had problems. You know, Yoko had gone back on drugs, but they were staying together. So there's a chapter about the death and the horrible aftermath, but that wasn't even the worst that could happen, because their trusted employees started stealing from them, stole John's diaries, conspired to slander John and Yoko, and they did. Some of these books became bestsellers, filled with lies. There were kidnapping threats, extortion threats. Yoko was terrified. She had to move to a hotel with Sean for a while. And she was once being interviewed at the Dakota, and she told the reporter, oh, look, John used to be so big and now he's so small. And she shows him the urn on the table. I mean, this is what she had to go through. And I showed them as a family, not just as celebrities. In like one instance, after John died, the cats would wait at the kitchen door for him to come in, and they'd become scared after a while when he didn't show up. And then they would sit on the radio when his songs would come on. And yeah. So Yoko purchased John's childhood home, Mendip's, in Liverpool. She preserved it and donated it to the National Trust, and she ensured that a creak in the step would be maintained, because he had to jump over that step every night, so when he came in late, so he wouldn't wake up his aunt. And when I went there last summer, I went up that step, and sure enough, it's there. And she's just marveling that such a small room, he had such big dreams. And that room is so small. There's a bed the length of this table, and there's not much room to walk, and then there's a little cabinet, and that's it, this tiny little room he lived in. And Yoko gave up her own work for 10 years to promote John's artwork and nurture his legacy. She started releasing his unheard music because she felt so badly for the fans, and she promised she'd put out something every year. They did the Lost Lennon tapes. She created Strawberry Fields in Central Park across from the Dakota as a big memorial for John. And the most beautiful thing is, one day in November, the yellow leaves of the ginkgo tree from Japan drop all at once right on the Imagine mosaic. It's gorgeous. And there's a picture of that somewhere. You probably saw it. And the Imagine Peace Tower in Iceland was created. In 1965, she had a list of imaginary works, and that light tower was on it. And John said, could you build this in my garden? And she said, well, that's just conceptual. And then decades later, it became Imagine Peace Tower in Iceland, and it's lit on his birthday every year. chapter called Premonitions, about all the eerie predictions in their lives and the lyrics they said or things they were told by psychics and others, prefacing what came later. His wife Cynthia said, "When I first set eyes on Yoko, I knew she was the one for John. It was pure instinct. The chemistry was right. The mental aura that surrounded them was almost identical." And Yoko released Seasons of Glass in 1981, 6 months after John died. And most of those songs were written in the 70s, but they were appropriately prescient for a grieving widow and who she wrote them so long ago. She consulted psychics, astrologers. She believes in animism and the supernatural, and John considered her a spiritual advisor, trusted her instincts and wisdom. And Elliot Mintz asked John about this, and John said, "She'll say things you won't understand. Just go with it. She's always right." And yeah, she's extraordinary. So I'll just close with this quote that she said about John. "John had 3 small moles down the center of his forehead. Buddha was supposed to have had the same, and that was considered in the Orient as a sign of a very wise man. John's oval classic face resembled a kabuki mask. He carried his body with a lightness that gave grace to his movements. He was in his 20s when I met him. I was 8 years older, but I never thought of him as somebody younger than me. When you were near him, his strong mental vibe was too heavy for a young person. Some people are born old. That was John. His clowning was just play acting, but it was obvious to anybody around him that he was a very heavy dude." So that's the story. So I just wanted to say, millions of people are now experiencing her exhibitions all over the world. There's a big one at the Tate in London recently. Everybody's walking through these white spaces, participating in the art. Children are loving it. And, maybe one day she'll be accepted. I think it's coming. And one day in 1986, she invited me to a party. And it was at this club. And the DJ was playing her song, Walking on Thin Ice. And people started dancing. And I'm like, "Look, everybody's dancing. This is great." She goes, "Oh, well, maybe I'm becoming too commercial." So that's probably what she would think now. And I'm just thrilled that people are enjoying the book. And this is really an hour of talking is the tip of the iceberg. The book is just a wealth of information to help you heal, to help you get to know her better. And it's not just a biography, it's just really, really special. And if you like it, please leave a brief review anywhere you can, Amazon, Goodreads, on social media. I just think her true story needs to be told and read by everyone. So that's that.